Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar on public funding for fossil fuels, from part of the problem to part of the solution. My name is Roy Culpepper. I chair the Group of 78. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that the City of Ottawa, the place from which I'm making these introductory remarks, is in the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. As we discuss how to combat the climate crisis, including by eliminating our production and consumption of fossil fuels, we must recognize that Indigenous communities have for many generations stewarded the rivers, coasts, forests, and the land. We must learn from their example and respect this legacy. This webinar is co-hosted by the Group of 78 and Climate Legacy. Climate Legacy will be introduced by our moderator, Ricky Stewart. I'll just say a few words about the Group of 78. Since its origins in 1981, the Group of 78 has promoted dialogue about a progressive Canadian foreign policy based on the principles of sustainable peace, social justice, and survival of our planet in the face of modern human activity. Members of our audience may be interested in an upcoming webinar the Group of 78 is organizing on June 16th, next week, featuring Dr. Peter Singer of the World Health Organization. Dr. Singer, an eminent Canadian bioethicist, will be speaking on the subject of global vaccine justice, a tale of two pandemics. Now, on to our discussion. The production and combustion of fossil fuels is acknowledged to be one of the primary sources of greenhouse gases in Canada. In April, Prime Minister Trudeau announced that Canada will slash its greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 45% over 2005 levels by the year 2030. While many welcome this announcement, it seems at odds with what the federal government and provincial governments are actually doing to meet this target. The aim of today's panel is to identify the contradictions in public policy, particularly the allocation of funding and subsidies, and to point to alternative ways of deploying public funds that would help reach our climate targets. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, who will say a few words about climate legacy and introduce our distinguished speakers. Ricky Stewart has just joined us from Victoria, BC, and works part-time as a consultant on organizational change and gender equality with UN organizations, governments, and NGOs. Ricky has had an illustrious career. Among other things, she was executive director of Oxfam Canada and was deputy director of the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. She has taught at St. Francis Xavier University's Coady Institute. She's been a volunteer teacher, consultant, and board member, and is currently affiliated with Gender at Work and with the Climate Legacy Project. Ricky, thanks so much for moderating this panel, and over to you.
Thank you. Good morning to you all from Victoria. It's with great pleasure that on behalf of Climate Legacy that we bring you this webinar today. Climate Legacy is a project originated by a group of people who at the time were mostly living in Ottawa. And its aim was to make sure that seniors were encouraged and had an opportunity to participate in climate action. We don't run our own programs, but we encourage organizations and seniors to become active on climate issues using their voice, their time, and their money. Today's talk will be a little bit about the money that we put into taxes and how that is being used or not to support climate justice. Today, what we're going to hear is from two distinguished speakers whom I will introduce in a moment. And they will be asked to speak for no more than about maximum 15 minutes each. And then we will go to questions. I would like to ask you to put your questions in chat, because that way we can keep track of the order, and I will be exercising my moderator's prerogative to try and combine some of the questions that we see and direct them to the panelists. We may, at some time during the session, also ask you for your opinions and your feedback by using the mechanisms that are available through Zoom to help you tell us what you think. I have the great pleasure to introduce the two panelists today. First person I'm going to introduce is Vanessa Corkal, who's a policy analyst with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, where she focuses on fossil fuel subsidies, just transition, and green recovery. She combines her expertise in climate change mitigation with over 9 years of documentary, journalism, and nonprofit experience in climate change research, communications, and project management. For the Prairie Climate Centre at the University of Winnipeg, the First Nations ADAPT program. She holds a Master's of Climate Change from the University of Waterloo. Mitchell Beer is the publisher of The Energy Mix, a thrice weekly e-digest on climate change, energy, and a carbon-free future. He started his work on renewable energy in 1977 and in climate change in 1997. He gave a TEDx Ottawa talk in October 2019 on how to build wider public demand for rapid decarbonization. His proudest moment, or a proudest moment, was building a model wind turbine out of wood stir sticks with his then 11-year-old daughter. And improv comedy practices are often the best part of his week. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to the panelists.
Thanks very much, Ricky, and thank you everybody for being here. I'll just bring my slides up. Okay, somebody please flag if this is not visible, thanks once again. The ground that I hope to cover over the next few minutes, the three things I really want to leave you with are, first of all, the collapse of the fossil fuel industry is underway and accelerating, even if we can't always see it in the moment. Secondly, the very important information that net zero is not zero. And third, that if we continue to fail to appreciate those first 2 points, that Canada will be missing a huge, massive opportunity to both contribute to and benefit from the transition of carbon. All of this as background to the more specific material that you'll be hearing from Vanessa. I'm really looking forward to her presentation and also to the discussion that follows. I've just briefly skimmed the participants list, and the expertise in this room is astonishing. So it gets set for a fantastic discussion once we're through the presentations. The fossil industry collapse is underway. It's been rolling. It's been picking up steam since 2014 or 15. And one important milestone along the way occurred less than a month ago on May 18th, 2021, when the International Energy Agency released this report, its Net Zero by 2050 roadmap. It was the first time the International Energy Agency had ever modeled what it would look like if the world actually got serious about limiting average global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the findings were stark and shocking, although not shocking to anybody who's been involved in this scenario work to date, that by 2050, consumption demand for oil is down 75%. Demand for gas is down 55%. And there are many scenarios that show more than that. Any remaining production will be with low-cost producers, so that more than 50% of the remaining fossil production will be with OPEC, which means that a well-known high-cost producer like Canada will be pretty much off that map. And the takeaway paragraph that we were all of us quoting everywhere with great delight, this is a more colloquial version of it, that basically that as of this year, as of 2021, no new oil, gas, or coal fields, not now, not anywhere, not ever. So why this is such a big deal is that the IEA for many years has produced its annual World Energy Outlook. If you can see it clearly on the slide, they are not modest about describing this annual release as the gold standard of energy analysis. And until now, their modeling has always shown that you can basically have whatever future fossil fuel scenario you want, as long as consumption and production and demand keep on growing. The International Energy Agency will tell you, oh, it's just a projection. We're not predicting the future. Look around our office. Do you see a crystal ball anywhere? But in fact, that projection is taken as exactly that. It's taken as a prediction, so that governments, agencies, institutions, certainly fossil fuel companies, until this latest release, the government of Alberta was always just so happy to quote the International Energy Agency, where even in what they call their sustainable development scenario, they were still showing that you can have whatever fossil fuel future you want, as long as it entails continuing growth and demand. And that basic prior assumption, I believe the IEA when they say that they're just trying to produce a diligent projection to help drive better policy making. But the reality is that that projection has played a major role in driving trillions of dollars in new fossil fuel project investment since the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. And then entered into force in 2016. Hundreds of billions of dollars by the big five Canadian banks alone. And they're doing it basically because the IEA said they could. So in addition to that milestone event, this happened. In a single day, stop reading your slides, Mitchell, but this did happen. On a single day on May 26, 2021, a court in The Hague in the Netherlands found that the highly touted, highly controversial target that Royal Dutch Shell had set to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions 20% by 2030, that target was not adequate, that target did not meet Shell's human rights obligations. And the judge said that what would begin to meet those obligations would be a 45% reduction in emissions by 2030 across all of Shell's global operations. Shell immediately, no surprise, said that they would appeal the ruling, although they're up against a legal team that seems to keep winning appeals. There's almost a side industry in these photos of lawyers from the Netherlands hugging each other with cameras and boom mics around after they win another case or another appeal. But while this appeal is pending, it's binding. And that was not all that happened. Exxon Mobil held its annual meeting, and a tiny hedge fund that is less than a year old called Engine Number One. Everybody in the finance industry thought it was really funny that they were named after a children's book. Engine Number One, which held just 0.2% of the total share value of Exxon, was able to organize to have 3 out of Exxon's 12 board positions replaced by its nominated directors who were running on a platform of more robust climate disclosure and Exxon taking responsibility for its greenhouse gas emissions. Chevron held a shareholders meeting the same day, and the direction from their shareholders was that the company really needed to start getting serious about its Scope 3 emissions. And I apologize for the jargon out of the world of international carbon accounting. But if you think about the way a barrel of oil is produced and then distributed, it gets extracted, it gets put on a pipeline or in a rail car, and then if it doesn't end up on the bottom of the Kalamazoo River, if it doesn't end up incinerating downtown Lake Megantic, it eventually gets to its destination, and then it's used as directed and helps fry the planet. It's that used as directed, which is the Scope 3 emissions when it's used right at the end of the line. And those emissions represent about 80% of the total greenhouse gas emissions of the total carbon in the whole production process for oil. So that's something that fossil companies have really not wanted to look at over the years, and certainly not look at seriously. And now Chevron shareholders are saying, no, we need to start looking at this. So all of that ties in with the growing recognition that net zero is not zero. And this is a phrase that I began seeing last year, and I can remember thinking toward the end of the year that, sometime toward the end of 2021, maybe in 2022, that this language, this line of thought, line of argument would really start to land. And I'm really pleased to tell you how wrong I was, because in February, it was everywhere. And that tells us, I think that should tell us a few things. First of all, that the expectation for climate action is really ramping up and broadening, as it needs to. Secondly, that the spin around net zero is ramping up in tandem with terms like net zero and decarbonization often taking on a very different meaning from what most of us would expect. And at root, what we are up against is the very wrong notion that we can have a zero target and a fossil fuel economy when really we need to choose. And by the way, we also need to make the right choice. So this could either be a very long or very short reading between the lines, a very long or short sort of mini guide to some of the language to listen for and to decode the various net zero targets that are coming forward. And as Ricky was suggesting earlier, it'll be the short version. First of all, does the target commit to 2050 or 2030? It's easy for anyone to say, oh, sure, we mean it. We'll be net zero, whatever that means, by 2050. But the decision maker making that commitment is not going to be in a position to deliver on it all the way through. They may not be alive 30 years from now. So really what they are saying is that at some point in the future, depending on some unknown technology that is currently in the realm of science fiction, at some point in the future, we'll start taking this seriously, as opposed to a 2030 target that gets at the reality that was set out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2018 that we have until the end of this decade to cut emissions 45%. So that's the target that you heard in the Dutch court case. Secondly, and again, which technologies are they relying on? Are these renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies that are practical and affordable and ready for prime time right now? Or are we relying way too heavily on options like industrial carbon capture that are currently way too expensive and complex to scale up with no really realistic prospect that they will be reliably available in the time that we have to get the climate crisis under control? I know there's much better expertise on this call than mine on small modular nuclear reactors. But I would love to hear that come up in the Q&A if people want to raise it. The best description I've heard is that these are literally PowerPoint reactors. There's no detailed engineering behind them, and yet they're somehow expected to scale up in time to help us get greenhouse gas emissions under control. The next issue, again, scope 3 emissions. Are we talking about the production emissions that fossil companies have been trying to reduce, the energy they need to consume, the carbon they need to emit to extract and produce a barrel of oil, which is where their attention is? Or are we seriously focusing on the downstream emissions that for Exxon, for example, amounted to 700 million tons of carbon dioxide in 2019 alone? And then finally, how quickly banks, pension funds, other elements of the financial community are being engaged and getting engaged and involved in actually diverting investment from the things we don't want to the things we do, because they control a lot of the story and they really need to continue stepping up and step up more. So much of what's behind this is the notion, and frankly, we have carried this forward in a lot of our messaging. I don't think we've done it on purpose, but within the climate community, we often convey, and certainly the fossil industry wants to convey, that, oh, sure, yeah, okay, we've seen all the crisis reports. We get it that climate change is an issue, but we'd better take our medicine. Doing something about this is going to hurt. And there's another storyline that says that it is about opportunity and gain. This was a report that was issued in 2018 by the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. And this report projected 65 million low carbon jobs by 2030 around the world, $26 trillion in economic benefits, 700,000 premature deaths prevented, and in 2030 alone, $2.8 trillion in public revenues. And that is the one moment when it's probably okay to read the whole slide because it bore repeating. In Canada, this study released by Environmental Defence Canada in January was produced by the former Unifor economist Jim Stanford, who now heads the Centre for Future Work out west. And what Stanford found was, first of all, that since the fossil collapse began, again in 2014 or 15, the surrounding economy has created 42 new jobs for every one that was lost in the fossil industry. Secondly, that there are specifically 18 communities he could identify across the country that depend on the fossil industry for 5% or more of their employment, which really tells us two things. First of all, each one of those communities absolutely deserves and needs all the time and attention and funding and resources and support, whatever it needs, to make sure that nobody's left behind. And secondly, it's 18 communities. It's doable. And I think that on the way to that doable, one of the biggest challenges is to move this out of the big picture theory that says, well, of course we want nobody left behind, and get right down to the specific opportunity. Because when you're in that conversation and somebody whose job is actually affected by this transition says, okay, so what's this going to mean for me? Really, the right way to answer that question is with a question. What do you need? What does your community need? What are the opportunities around you? What have you always wanted to do all your life? This might be an opportunity to train for that, right? So it's not a simple answer, but it's an inclusive answer if it's done right. And just quickly, I was talking to somebody in Saskatchewan over the weekend, and he was explaining that the town of Estevan population of 11,500 is pretty much completely dependent on the three fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. And in Stanford's report, 20.7% of their direct employment comes from the fossil industries. So if you count indirect, it's a single sector town. And this person was saying, it's a real challenge because there's really not a whole lot Estevan can do, except they've got lots of agriculture and great solar, and there's probably some tourism potential. And I listened to that and I thought, that ain't nothing. And it's not as easy as saying, "Oh, Estevan, just do this. We'll check the box." There's no box checking here, but it's the envisioning and the imagining and then the solidifying around that plan. That's where a transition starts to make sense. People start to see themselves in the picture, and it's about opportunity and gain. So ultimately, for the country as a whole, really, it's time. I'm sorry about that extra link in the middle of the photo. I don't know where that came from. It's time to pick a lane. Do we want a fossil-first climate strategy or a climate-first economic strategy? We need to decide whether the next 2 years are going to be about rebuilding the economy or staying tied to the fossil industry. And one of the prompts is that more and more countries are beginning to get this right and moving powerfully to get this right. And Canada is seriously in danger of being left behind if we don't. So to summarize, the takeaways that I would suggest to you: the fossil collapse is with us and it's accelerating. Net zero is not zero. We dare not, must not, cannot miss this opportunity. And it's time to pick a lane. And finally, just briefly, I'll keep this URL up for a few seconds. If you would like to find more, a lot of it is on the Energy Mix. Thank you. And I really hope I stayed within the 15 minutes.
You did. Thank you, Mitchell. And now over to Vanessa.
Great, thanks. There we go. Hi, everybody. My name is Vanessa. I am so happy to be joining you today. I feel a bit silly speaking to you as a subsidy expert, since I know I could learn so much from each of you that are attending today, being relatively new to the climate and policy space myself. I'm originally from Treaty 6 territory, Saskatoon. So the issue of transition really resonates strongly with me every time I go back and visit with my family and their friends. I realize how stark the difference in how far the conversations have gone is. And there's a lot more work to be done. So I hope that what I present today will be helpful to some of you in helping move this conversation along in Canada. I'm just going to start my slides here. Just give me 2 seconds. All right. Okay, can someone confirm you see this? Yes, okay. So just before I'm going to talk today about fossil fuel subsidies and support and what those terms mean and how much we have in Canada. But first, I want to kind of step back and add to some of the context that Mitchell went over, which is we did a study late last year, which built on something we had done in 2019 with a number of other institutes, including the United Nations Environment Program, looking at the gap we call the production gap, which is the levels of fossil fuel production that we need to have worldwide to get to our goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees versus what countries are actually planning. So you can see that gap outlined here. You can see the red line is planned production. The gold line is targets, and you can see the blue line is 1.5 and the green is 2 degrees. So there's a clear gap in terms of where we need to be getting to. And to meet that 1.5 degree target, globally, we have to decrease fossil fuel production by 6% a year over the next 10 years. But instead, countries are planning and projecting an average increase of 2% per year. As we know, there's been increasing calls this year for green recovery. I love to quote UN Chief Antonio Guterres, Secretary General, who's been really, really strong on this file over the past year, calling for an end to fossil fuel subsidies and public finance for fossil fuel subsidies. Canada's official commitment internationally was made through the G20 and the G7, which is to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. That word inefficient is really something we get hung up on a lot, that frankly was put in there to achieve a diplomatic agreement, but actually is holding us back, in my opinion. And arguably, when you look at what the world actually needs, phasing out subsidies alone is actually not enough. We need to be phasing out all types of support for fossil fuels, anything that distorts the market in favor of fossil fuels and makes our clean and proven energy solutions seem unachievable. So just to recap what Mitchell went over, major map given by the IEA that if governments are serious about the climate crisis, there can be no new investments in oil, gas, and coal from this year. That's a quote from Fatih Birol, they're the head of the agency. And so we need to talk about what this means for Canada. But first, a little background on terminology. I see like generally subsidies is not necessarily the most understandable thing if you're not familiar with the whole world of fossil fuel finance. So helpful to just go over a few terms. Often you'll hear the word subsidies. So this is the term that we use at IASD. This is used because there's an agreed upon definition under the World Trade Organization. So most countries have agreed to this definition, and there are established international methodologies to measure what subsidies exist based on that definition. However, subsidies don't capture all the money that's being put towards fossil fuels because it's a very specific and narrow definition. So sometimes you'll see the term support. We use that term to include subsidies, but also include other types of money for fossil fuels like public finance and other supports like COVID-19 relief. And then if you look outside that circle, if you look at these as concentric circles, you can talk about externalities. So these are the true costs of fossil fuel use and all the other costs that they pose to society, whether it's pollution, climate change, health impacts, environmental damage, and more. So types of subsidies at the federal level are a little all over the place, but the most common are tax breaks and direct spending. At the provincial level, we also see many subsidies in the form of royalty credits. So royalties that are supposed to be paid to provincial governments for the mining of public resources, for natural resources, intended to finance public goods like health and education. Often companies get discounts or credits on those programs, so those are considered fossil fuel subsidies. But in addition to those kind of direct spending and foregone revenue, governments are also increasingly taking on other types of subsidies, whether they're providing loans, loan guarantees, insurance, taking on environmental liabilities. Sometimes those things are easy to measure in terms of the amount, but sometimes they're harder, especially when there's a lack of data available. So again, Canada's international commitments, we have subsidy commitments under the Sustainable Development Goals. We have subsidy commitments under the AHE biodiversity targets and also the G7 and the G20. So these are popping up in a number of international spaces. Some of these are specific to fossil fuel subsidies. The biodiversity ones are not, but they are kind of broadly about harmful environmental subsidies, which would include fossil fuels. And clearly, even though we don't have specific obligations under the Paris Agreement, subsidy reform is a precondition to meet our Paris Agreement goals. And again, over 170 countries have agreed to the World Trade Organization definition of subsidy. So there really is no excuse for moving along on this file. And I also want to sort of myth bust the idea of inefficient subsidies. So we hear often from elected officials that Canada has already reformed its inefficient subsidies, that the ones in place are efficient and not harmful. However, and in particular, we often hear that money that helps fossil fuel producers reduce greenhouse gas emissions or has environmental benefits is not a subsidy. So a good example would be the $1.7 billion that was announced last year to help fossil fuel producers clean up orphan and abandoned wells. There are clear environmental benefits to this amount, but it's important to call this what it is. It is a subsidy. It is a situation where government is taking on the burden of environmental liabilities instead of adhering to what's called the polluter pays principle, where the companies would be responsible for that environmental damage. And the situation with all of these is that this money ultimately lowers the cost of business for fossil fuel producers. So it is still a subsidy under the international definition, and there are also hidden costs. So we ask for government to be transparent about those, to call them what they are, to develop robust criteria for efficiency, and ultimately to plan to transition away from these types of subsidies. So in terms of how much there are in Canada, if you look across the country, pre-COVID, we were looking at about $4.8 billion in subsidies. Many of these are occurring at the provincial level. So as I mentioned before, many of these are royalty credits. That's the vast majority of the ones in BC. You can see Alberta has nearly $2 billion. Roughly half of that is royalty related. And then we have provinces like Ontario and Quebec, whose subsidies are largely related to production, or not production, but rather fossil fuel consumption. So subsidies or tax exemptions that lower the cost of using things like natural gas as consumers. Federally, which is where we tend to put most of our advocacy and research focus, pre-COVID levels were about Canadian $600 million, but that's changed substantially because of the pandemic. So this is the report that we put out in January, which looked at how subsidies have changed since COVID hit. We've actually seen a tripling in subsidies at the federal level, from 600 million last year to 1.9 in 2020, 1.9 billion. And this is largely because, again, of the orphan wells money, as well as the funding that was provided to Newfoundland to support the offshore industry. When you factor in all the other types of support, including public finance, Canada actually provides around $18 billion per year. If you factor in all the other costs, including the costs of health-related impacts, pollution-related impacts, we're looking at around $63 billion. So that's not direct money, but it is the cost of fossil fuels. And in particular, you might be wondering why a huge jump from the subsidies number to the support number is because of the amount of money that Canada puts in public finance towards fossil fuels. And the vast majority of that comes from our export credit agency, Export Development Canada. So Export Development Canada, it was designed as an export credit agency for financing internationally, but there's been changes made to its structures in that it is able to do financing domestically as well. And that was done after the 2008 financial crisis. And after COVID hit, there was even more concessions made to Export Development Canada to be able to provide, and also Business Development Bank of Canada provides specific supports to domestic fossil fuel producers. So on average, they provide over $13 billion a year to fossil fuels domestically and internationally. They are the main financer of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And frankly, Canada is super behind the mark on public finance. We've seen countries like the UK, Sweden, France, and the Netherlands already taking steps on public finance. In particular, the UK announced last year that they were going to stop all international public finance, except in very extreme situations. And so this is something where we really are trying to bang the drum in Canada and try to get Canada to change these policies. In particular, I wanted to highlight this report that we released yesterday, which highlights that the amount of finance being provided by some of these agencies internationally, including Export Development Canada, a lot of it is going towards gas. And gas is not a bridge fuel, either within Canada or elsewhere. This research found that public institutions provide 4 times as much finance for gas as for wind and solar energy. So when Canada is providing funding to low and middle income countries, whether it's through its international climate finance or through agencies like Export Development Canada, we should really be prioritizing clean energy, not oil and gas. And if you want to read more about that report specifically, you can check the bit.ly link at the bottom of the screen here. So I encourage you to check out that research. Where we are at right now on this file in Canada is that we have seen some positive moves. Canada did announce reform of some of its tax-related subsidies a few years ago. They've also increased transparency on those measures, but overall, I would say there's very little data available on the levels of subsidies in Canada. We don't have information on most of those tax measures. We also had Canada commit to doing a peer review of their fossil fuel subsidies with Argentina. This was over 2 years ago, and we still haven't heard anything. So we're trying to put pressure to get Canada to publish the results of their review and to complete this as soon as possible. We also saw them reiterate their subsidy commitments in their recent climate plan, that was announced in December. But concretely, there has been no new action on this file. And the commitment that keeps getting reiterated is the commitment to phase out inefficient subsidies, which is full of loopholes and also doesn't address the public finance issue. So as we are recovering from COVID, we have a serious risk of recovery funding and relief being misused. You might have seen these headlines in the fall. There was investigations that the emergency wage subsidy, the companies that were receiving that had actually paid money in dividends to shareholders, including oil and gas companies like Imperial Oil. Last week, you probably saw the news that Air Canada was paying money to bonuses and paying bonuses to their top executives after receiving billions of dollars in relief from the government. So this is a serious concern for us as government is doling out unprecedented amounts of money in the wake of the COVID crisis. And we really need to use this money to pivot towards a green recovery. So the other challenge, of course, that Mitchell outlined is the urgency of the need to transition in a way that supports workers and communities. So to take just a regional example of oil in Alberta, we released a report a couple of weeks ago that shows that regardless of the environmental situation, by 2030, market forces and geopolitics are going to drive a long-term decline in oil in Alberta, and we're looking at around 20,000 job losses annually. Again, this number is something that can be dealt with. As Mitchell noted in his presentation, this is doable. We can address this, but we're not going to address it by putting public support to the sector and putting public money at risk. A better plan would be to put this money towards economic diversification, do some long-term planning, and to support those workers and communities that are being affected. So what we are asking increasingly from ISD and many other environmental groups that are working on this is that we must stop putting money towards fossil fuels and put strong green strings on government funding. So green strings can be a number of things. The idea is that we're putting conditions on funding to ensure that any money that's flowing out the door from the federal level is tied directly to our climate objectives. So for example, if we're providing money to industry, we should be ensuring that those companies are obligated to create net zero plans, that we should be prioritizing money for jobs and ensuring that there's conditions for that money not to go towards executives and shareholders, that these conditions be enforced and be transparent. We outline a number of other conditions in this report, and if you want to check that out, you can also check the bit.ly link at the bottom of the screen. But essentially, we are asking for increased transparency in all of the COVID-related funding that is going out the door, and also some of the recent money that was announced in the climate plan, including $8 billion for heavy industry to increase clean tech, that there needs to be strong conditions applied to that as well. So main takeaways. I know I've gone over a lot of technical things in this presentation, so if there's anything that needs clarification, please do ask in the Q&A. But I hope you take away from this presentation that despite some of the rhetoric we might hear from elected officials, that subsidies and public finance for fossil fuels are pervasive across Canada and its provinces, that this is both a federal and provincial issue. There is momentum to shift this, as we've seen with some of the examples internationally, but we need more pressure from the public towards elected officials in Canada because this is largely a political barrier towards making this change. And that lastly, we need a just transition for workers and communities. It has to happen alongside subsidy reform. So I will leave it there, and I guess we'll go to the discussion.
Thanks. And we have one set of questions from Stuart Evans so far, and he's asking not about the subsidies that the governments give, but what are the revenues? What is the benefit to governments for giving all these subsidies? And it would be, I don't know which one of you can answer that, but please, Mitchell, do you want to start? And then Vanessa?
Thanks, Ricky. I saw the question in the chat and you asked for specific data. Please, I don't have the data at my fingertips, but can supply that to the group afterwards if you want. Generally, what I would say is that government revenue is less than you think and less than we hear. There are so many examples, and a lot of the time that revenue is eroded by the subsidies that are put in place. I'm thinking, for example, of the massive and uncalled for subsidies to the liquefied natural gas industry in BC, where that is essentially revenue that will now not be coming into provincial coffers in a lot of cases. But again, so many instances where royalty rates have been reduced as the industry itself, in times when production is down. Royalties are obviously affected directly. But just generally, when royalty rates are brought down, with government saying, well, we're trying to help the government, we're trying to help the industry out, they're in a hard time, that's immediately a drop in revenue. And ironically, the pitch is, well, we want them creating jobs, don't we? Well, for the past number of years, the industry has been cutting back jobs and automating jobs as fast as they can. And there was a report recently that said that worldwide, 2 out of 10 fossil industry jobs could potentially be automated in the next decade. The Canadian industry and the US as well have a horrible term for this process. They call it demanning. And don't get me started on the multiple different problems I have with that term, but it's their language, right? And the basic argument is we've been high cost producers. We need to cut costs, and cutting costs is code for cutting jobs. So if governments are cutting royalties to try to sustain an industry that is no longer interested in creating jobs, it's a double hit. I guess the only other point is that in Alberta, there has been a lot of coverage and a lot of advocacy recently because the rural municipalities that depend on local property taxes are in a horrible bind because fossil fuel companies aren't paying their taxes, nor are they paying their leases to local landowners. And so these communities really don't have a whole lot else in the way of revenue. A large chunk is lost or at risk because they're not, the fossils aren't paying their taxes locally. Okay. So that's another level again, where it's not as good a revenue for government as you might think.
Vanessa, do you have more definite figures on the revenue that governments get? And there's a number of other questions on the list that I'd invite you to look at, particularly other subsidies.
Yeah, so I'm going to drop a link in the chat to a report that David Hughes did for the Corporate Mapping Project and for CCPA. I haven't done a look at royalties in particular, but he has, and there is a chart in there that has some of the more specific numbers on royalties. Generally, I would say that they have decreased, and what happens often is that companies will receive royalty credits to reduce how much they pay in future years as well. So a good example in BC is that the province has racked up $2.6 billion in credits that companies can use in future years to reduce the royalties that they have to pay. So there's a huge need to rejig some of those royalty frameworks. And BC is actually looking at doing an oil and gas royalty framework review that the government has announced. So we're hoping that there will be some momentum to look at that. But I would say that the common argument that subsidies are worth it because they receive so much in royalties or taxes is something that we need to do more work to debunk. But I think some of the figures out there already show that that's not the case. Ricky, would you like me to just look at questions from the Q&A?
One of the questions is anyone looking at subsidies for the nuclear industry? That's the next one on my list.
We have not. We have in the past, ISD has done some work under a global subsidies initiative. I think this is something that we do have interest in, but to be quite honest, it's a matter of funding. If we had money to do it, anyone knows anyone with grants to do it, let me know. And the same thing for provincial subsidies as well. I see there's a question about provincial subsidies. So we've done a number of reports on Nunavut, Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and British Columbia. You can see those reports on our website. But again, this is sort of limited by our internal capacity. And I would say that there are lots of provincial groups that seem to be interested in this as well, but I think it's partly a matter of capacity that we don't have the full numbers. That said, you can go to the OECD, the Organization for Economic Development Cooperation website, that has some of those figures. And we also launched a new website called fossilfuelSubsidyTracker.org. I will put the link in the chat. Or if you really want to look at some of the numbers, they're not comprehensive, but some of the data is done provincially through those sources.
Thank you. I also, the other question, the next question on the list is, how do you explain the recent rise in the price of oil that is of benefit to Jason Kenney and his supporters? Why is the price going up?
Mitchell, do you want to start?
I was about to say, Vanessa, would you like to start? To be honest, I have not been following this specific spike in the price of oil, so I'll be really brief. In general, though, the difference between that headline and the details you're hearing on this webinar is that in the short term, the prices will fluctuate a lot. Either because some factor drives the increase or because some of the market players are deliberately creating it. But that's different from the long-term collapse that really is increasingly upon us in the fossil industry.
Yeah, and I would say not being an economist or someone who follows the oil markets that closely, I also haven't followed the specific rise. I think the more general trend I would point to is how volatile oil markets can be, and that is something that we do model in the report that I mentioned that my colleague did called In Search of Prosperity, that you can Google In Search of Prosperity. I will also put that link in the chat. We do modeling on low oil prices and volatile oil prices between now and 2050. And actually, we see worst case scenario with that volatility because it really does make investors really skittish. So I would say that, in the short term, that may garner political support for Jason Kenney and some of the policies that are pro-oil. But I think it's a short-sighted strategy, and we really need to be looking at the longer term trends.
Thanks. I wanted to.
I'm sorry, if I could just quickly come back with one really, really quick point about that, and that is that there's a lot of short-term volatility in prices. But when investors get involved or countries or companies get involved in fossil fuel infrastructure, these are multi-decade investments. And they, can't and shouldn't be decided based on what the price of oil is doing today. It should be based on the trend lines, based on the direction of travel. And I think we're starting to see, I'd be curious if you're seeing differently, Vanessa, but I think we're starting to see that more and more investors are twigging to that and realizing that whatever's in front of them right now, really, this industry is not a good bet for the climate, but specifically for their investment goals.
There's a very interesting question from Lawrence coming to both of you, saying, what are the points most amenable to public pressure on these subsidy issues? And is that pressure gaining traction? So where would you invest your time and energy if you were wanting to make a difference on these subsidy issues? What kinds of subsidies, which level of government, how? Vanessa, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think it partly depends on where you are located. So if you are located in British Columbia, please write your MP or your MLA about the oil and gas royalty review. We actually have a really exciting window to move this file in British Columbia, especially as a province that claims to be pretty climate progressive. So there are lots of really great BC-based organizations working on subsidies, including Dogwood, Stand.Earth, My Sea to Sky, CCPA, Wilderness Committee. So I would encourage you to get involved with one of those organizations, or just as an individual to write your elected officials and encourage that review to be robust. And then, the subsidy file, because it's such a high level conversation, equally important to write your MPs about it and to get involved with some of the organizations that are pushing for this at the federal level. I think that the file that I see us having the most momentum on in the short term is Export Development Canada, because since the IEA report came out, it's become clear that that finance needs to stop. And there's many civil society organizations that are helping run campaigns to pressure Export Development Canada to change its targets. Unfortunately, beyond lobbying your elected officials, there's not as much you can do tangibly, like other files, like retrofitting your home, for example. So, but I would look, if anyone has pensions, that are part of public pension funds, obviously that is also part of the conversation and something that I didn't go over today.
Just on supplementary on that, Susan Carter is asking, when Canadian mining companies are drilling for oil or other fossil fuels in other parts of the world, would they be getting subsidies from the government of Canada? That, I think, relates to your EDC comment.
Yeah, so this is a big problem in terms of the data transparency. We don't have transaction level data from Export Development Canada. So it's difficult for us to say which companies are getting which subsidies. And this is something we're increasingly trying to get them to increase their transparency on. I would see all signs point to TS.
If we could move to another set of questions. There's two questions about transitions in the areas, Mitchell, that you were talking about for workers. And one question from W. Foster is, may we provide compensation in a transition plan? That's one question. And another comment from Peter Bear says, iron and earth trains workers to transition from fossil fuel jobs. Would you care to comment on those, Mitchell?
Sure, thanks. Just very quickly. First of all, yes, compensation, income support, basically whatever it takes for people who are currently in fossil fuel jobs to get from here to there and start crafting whatever the next future is. That's a lot of what that's a lot of the detailed planning that needs to go in for a just transition process to really be just, to really practical, to be really practical, to really work. Speaking from Ottawa, I am probably one of the last people on this call who should be presuming to speak for Alberta, but what I've understood from friends and colleagues in Alberta is that when people come from away and say, hey, we're all about a just transition and we really mean it, eyes roll. And the response is, sure, you're going to retrain me to get really good at saying, would you like fries with that 200 times a day? And ensuring that people have the steady household income to have the time and the space to discover something different from that is really essential to making it work, which ties right back to the point that the second point that you just made out, Ricky, and that is that for those who aren't familiar, Iron and Earth is an organization of former and possibly current tar sands workers who, among other things, have been doing a lot of work on training for non-fossil fuel jobs. And if you're not familiar with them, Iron and Earth is online, and they're a pretty remarkable organization. Okay.
Angela Keller-Herzog writes, what are the implications of the Canada-China trade and investment context on this issue in terms of Chinese investments in Canadian oil and gas? Are any of our Chinese investors on Biden's new expanded banned Chinese companies list? And what is the future of LNG exports to China?
So I can't really speak to the first two. I have not been following Chinese investments in particular. I don't tend to follow private finance as much. I just don't have the capacity as one person. I've been focused on the public. But I would say that regarding there's this oft quoted argument that LNG will displace dirtier types of fuels internationally. That's a very common argument we hear from Canadian federal and provincial governments for increasing subsidies or support to the LNG sector, that we're displacing, and that we're going to have this export market opportunity in Asia. I think, given the statistics that I showed before about gas not being a bridge fuel, from a climate perspective, that's already a dangerous stance. But I think the other thing is that there's geopolitics to consider, and the likelihood of China wanting to rely on exports, on imports for its energy sources rather than producing domestically is questionable from a geopolitical standpoint. And I don't really see that happening. But that is just my perspective.
Alongside that, some of the stories we've been following are that if, to whatever extent, China and other economies in Asia continue with significant demand for LNG, they'll be able to get it, or gas for that matter, they'll be able to get it from closer by at lower cost. And so, again, exports from Canada would be, or imports from Canada, I guess, would be in the exact same place the Alberta industry is now, that the product is far more expensive than the other sources that it's competing with internationally. But the other, and I'll say a more hopeful point to Vanessa's utterly essential point that gas is not a bridge fuel. More and more we are seeing just phenomenal growth, interest, investment in renewables in China and in other economies in Asia. So I wouldn't say that it's all the way there yet, but the momentum has just been stunning. And one source to watch, in addition to IISD, of course, is in the US, the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, IEEFA_Institute. A lot of the material on what's happening in the energy transition in Asia, we find from there, and it's a good place to start to get a continuing understanding of how the transition is unfolding.
I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. Stuart Evans asked, I'm struggling with the general feeling about what must be the case, in quotes. The government's position is not easy to defend if benefits don't outweigh the costs. So one of the things that strikes me about this discussion this morning is the lack of transparency and the lack of detail in the kind of information that we have available to us. And I'm wondering what might be some ways of tackling that. And John Williams asks, what are the prospects for an international agreement, hopefully binding, on the IEA targets? Like, is this an area worth pushing on, the information and the transparency at both the provincial and the federal level on both revenues and subsidies? Vanessa, can I ask you to go first?
Sure. And Stuart, if you're out there, please feel free to clarify. I was a little maybe unclear on what you're asking, but I think to John's question about the international agreement, a couple thoughts here. So the first thing is that the IEA report is groundbreaking. It's something that a lot of organizations had been pushing really hard for to get them to publish that net zero scenario. But that said, it's not the be all end all. It's not like that's the scenario and now we're running with it, right? Like there's still lots of flaws within that scenario. Lots of things that I think need to be challenged and improved upon. So that's going to be an increasing area of work, but it does now at least provide a benchmark of where we need to be getting to as a global community. In terms of the international agreement, I would say we have an international agreement. We have the Paris Agreement. So I would probably put focus on strengthening Canada's commitments and other developed countries' commitments under that agreement first, because that is already a process that's well underway. In particular, this year, some of you may already be aware, Canada is supposed to be submitting its new target, what's called the Nationally Determined Contribution, in advance of the next climate change conference that's supposed to be in Glasgow, although we don't know if it's going to happen there because COVID. So we are trying to encourage the government to have a very strong target in there. There's been other talk of agreements as well. There's an initiative called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Sorry, it's quite a mouthful. That some academics and NGOs have started worldwide to try to get a non-proliferation treaty, much like the one that was proposed for nuclear energy. Or nuclear missiles, sorry. So there is that out there, but I think politically these large agreements that require multiple countries to agree are very challenging and don't necessarily result in the short-term action that's needed. So my personal sense is that it's better to stick with the mechanisms that we do have and to focus on wrapping up what we can domestically.
Mitchell?
I was just nodding as Vanessa said what she said. Nothing to add.
Okay. So no comment on the question about whether it's useful or important to keep working on more transparency and more information. For example, Kathleen O'Hara asks, what about subsidies for renewables? It's hard to keep track of all the federal Liberals' promises.
It really is hard to keep track. I was struck by the 4-to-1 ratio in the slide that you showed a few minutes ago, Vanessa, and we're reporting on that release in tomorrow's mix, but I haven't read the report yet, so I was glad to see that's waiting later in the day. I think the couple of issues, Kathleen, first of all, are the sort of the balance in subsidies and the way it should weigh so much more strongly towards renewables, but also what the money should be spent on. And the example that comes to mind is that the federal government announced in the budget, and they've now confirmed, that they will be sending out $5,000 up to $5,000 grants, plus helping to cover the cost of before and after energy audits for homeowners to improve the energy efficiency of buildings. And buildings account for about 18% of Canadian emissions. So it's worth doing. That said, there are also new and there's been a lot of recent work on concepts of mass deep energy retrofits that are more expensive upfront, need to be organized differently, but can save much more energy, can deliver much more back to occupants in terms of energy cost savings, particularly in low-income households, in terms of home comfort, and drive down emissions faster. So I think an important point that where all of us just starting to fully get our arms around is, yes, the dollars have to shift. They also have to be spent to best benefit. And there are so many other examples of that out and around. But as we see these programs roll out, I don't have in my head the number of separate distinct programs in the federal climate plan, but there are enough of them that it really is hard to keep track to the point where that's almost a transparency issue. You know, just the task of monitoring and watching over all of that work, and it needs to be done.
Jeff Passmore asks, Vanessa, as I understand it, Japan has already rejected the IAE net zero report and will not follow its advice. Comment?
No comment on Japan specifically, although I will ask my colleagues if anyone's been following the Japan case. But I did want to follow up if folks are interested in regarding the transparency issue and following up on government commitments, not just for Canada, but for countries around the world. ISD has been tracking, along with a consortium of other international research institutions, all the energy-related money that's being spent post-recovery. So you can check out that website at energypolicytracker.org. And we do as best as possible try to include any financial commitments, and Japan is included there if you're curious. But I don't know their motivation specifically for not abiding by the IEA report.
I guess the one thing I would add, and this is not right now, it's not today, but I saw that Japan had said they don't take the IEA's advice, and they're in good company. So did Alberta within like nanoseconds of the report being released. The energy minister, the former pipeline executive, Sonia Savage, was out there saying, well, no, this was obviously just driven by activists, she said. Activists like the chair of COP26, who is a minister in the Boris Johnson cabinet, who I'm sure would be shocked to be called an activist. But it doesn't, there's a level where it doesn't matter. Of course it matters, but there's a level where it doesn't matter that Japan says, no, we don't accept the advice, or Alberta just does what it's going to do and rejects the analysis. Because just as the IEA giving its stamp of approval to the continuing assumption that there's going to be future growth in demand for fossil fuels, the fact that they're now withdrawing that, and as Vanessa said, the report is far from perfect. It's got lots of flaws. It remains to be seen whether the same analysis will show up in this year's World Energy Outlook and in subsequent ones. But if the IEA really solidifies around this position, just as the previous advice was tremendously influential in driving investment and in driving trillions of dollars over time, as that message filters through the various communities and sort of financial and other communities and decision makers who look to the IEA for guidance. Governments can say what they're going to say, but those decisions will be made. And so, I mean, it's not as simple or as linear as I'm implying, just for sake of brevity, but it still has an impact.
Thank you. I think the message from this morning's webcast is that both the research and the information and the pressure that results do matter. They're having an influence, and we need to be able to keep it up and ramp it up. I've just been told that we're over time. So on behalf of everyone who's been participating, I'd like to thank the panelists, Vanessa and Mitchell, thank the Group of 78, and Climate Legacy for organizing this. And we will keep you informed if there are future webinars, and hope that you will join us, and hope that you will, in fact, be part of that taking action and ramping up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd just like to add my word of thanks to Ricky, to all the panelists, and to the contributors in our audience. And please tune into our webinar next Wednesday with Peter Singer on global vaccine justice, a tale of two pandemics. Hope to see you all then. Thank you.